And it really is a good analogy because that's kind of what you do. If you're a doctor and you have a patient who is going to go through some discomfort, the temptation is to give them a drug.
Something to relieve the pain.
Yeah, so that they don't feel it. But now more and more doctors say, no, it's part of that process. Like taking away a fever is a bad thing because the fever is a clearing
Fever
mechanism.
is your friend.
Fever's your friend, and it's a clearing mechanism. For a long time, it was thought that anytime somebody has a fever, we need to give them aspirin or ibuprofen or something else.
Right.
So that's a good analogy to think about kind of the role of the Fed. So the Fed, rather than holding back and saying, look, we need to wash out, we need to have a clearing of bad decisions, bad investment, bad companies that were just kind of hanging on. So when these things happen periodically, they serve a very valuable function.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell features guests each week to discuss prominent topics for those over 55. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today we want to talk about some, I guess I'd call it more financial stuff, because I know that is a hot topic right now, given the fact that there's a lot going on in the world.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, so we thought we would take today and I would kind of give some thoughts and comments and try to anticipate some of the questions or concerns that you guys are having about, what is the right decision to make in an environment where there's so much up in the air.
So much uncertainty.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. You might say, well, there's always uncertainty about the future, which is true, but it's not always equally uncertain. I mean, this is one of those periods where it's hard to know how to plan. I mean, let's go over the headwinds or the sources of uncertainty. I guess we could start with Ukraine.
That's a big one.
Huge issue, and we don't know how big of an issue it's going to be as we do this show today. Mm-hmm. So today is what, the 23rd? You're probably watching this, a week or less later. But as of this point, we just don't know. Is this going to settle pretty quickly? I mean, is Zelensky, Putin, are they going to reach a compromise? I would hope that Zelensky doesn't give away much.
Right.
I mean, I'm really
It's been going on a month now.
I know, it's just so outrageous what Putin has shown himself capable of that I hate to think that that there could be a settlement where Zelensky just, and I understand, I'm not criticizing him. If any of us were in his shoes, we'd be tempted to settle if we thought that the alternative is we're going to be wiped out.
Right. Bring peace some way.
Yeah, and salvage what he can of his country. I hope he doesn't do that, because that would go back to, for lack of a better way to put it, business as usual for Putin.
Yeah.
Now, there'll still be sanctions and there'll still be hardship, but the idea that Putin probably walks away and endures even discomfort and misery for a period of time, that's no consolation, because he's still in power.
Right.
And I really would like to see this result in his being removed. And naturally, we'd all like to see that happen without a thermonuclear war.
That's the scary part.
Yeah.
Is he really capable of doing something like that? You hear all types of arguments about that.
Well, I think one thing about it, I think we all agree that he would be capable if it were an existential threat. I even think I read somewhere where he made that statement, which surprised me, because it's essentially a concession that I won't use them unless I think Russia's existence is at stake. But anyway, so we all know he'll do that, even if he hadn't said that. The question is, would he do it for far less reasons, far less defensible reasons?
Right.
So the Ukraine is a big issue, and it affects how we think about inflation. It has an effect inflation because it affects supply chains.
Yeah.
It affects oil prices, food prices. I mean, energy and agriculture are two big components of the CPI. And forget the CPI. They're two big components for everybody's budget, and both are hugely impacted by this. I mean, we all know the extent to which energy prices are impacted. But apart from that, many people don't realize that Russia and Ukraine are a breadbasket of the world to some extent. Now, the United States can outproduce any country in the world in terms of agricultural output. But in terms of supplying what has routinely been the source for people in Southern Hemisphere nations especially, much of that has come from the Ukraine and Russia.
Russia, right.
So those supplies are going to be disrupted. And for Ukraine for a long time, even if this is resolved in short order. So, and then, of course, we can't forget the sanctions. So to what extent is Russia, even in the aftermath of this, their goods will be sanctioned, being provided anywhere around the world.
Right.
So that's just a huge issue, but I'll go through these others a little more quickly. We've had a pandemic which is, one of these epic events for which there are few analogies because it occurs so rarely that you have anything as ubiquitous around the world as this has been.
Can you believe it's been 2 years?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it was 2 years, but it was two very, very different years from anything we've known since the, 1918, 1919?
The Spanish flu?
Yeah. So they had similar conditions, incidentally, back then, but this is, there just aren't many analogies for this for us to point to where it's been quite this large and consuming.
What do you compare it to, in our lifetime at least?
Yeah, not in our lifetime.
No.
Not shutting down an entire economy. Even an economist. I mean, if you were to ask any economist in academia, tell us what happens when you shut down, when you order by fiat all the, effectively, stores across industries to close. Can an economy, turn a switch and come back on? Well, surprisingly, it looks like much of that has happened. It does seem that there has been a rebound of sorts.
Well, yeah, but then you have the problem with the worker shortage.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
a huge implication. I think it's related to all of this quantitative easing. We've had a very liberal, it's called an accommodative policy through the Fed. We've had a very accommodative policy through fiscal spending, but probably more than we should have, quite frankly. I'm sure some of it was necessary, that the PPC money that was PPP, what is it called? Anyway.
Yes, I know.
Those funds that the first round of offerings, which occurred in 20, I can see where those were clearly necessary, but additional monies that have been provided fiscally might have been unnecessary, might have helped stimulate the inflation in a way that wasn't necessary. But who knows? Maybe the inflation was just going to happen. Because remember, we have another factor here. So we've talked about the pandemic. We've talked about the Ukraine. Don't forget the fact that here we are, 12 to 13 years down the road, long in tooth of a bull market. Think about that. In a bull market for that period of time. You may say, well, wait, but there was a 20% correction in 20 in April, or I think it's early April of 2020. Yeah, there was. But remember, that doesn't count. I mean, it doesn't count when...
Why do you say that?
Well, because we shut down the entire economy.
Okay.
So,
okay.
There are patterns in which economies behave over time, and there are rules of thumb that we've seen historically. And those rules of thumb are helpful in predicting what things will happen in the future. But then when you throw in some black swan event.
Something so unusual.
Yeah, where it's almost like a command economy. Well, it was a command economy. White House issues an order, the economy shut down or the industry shut down.
Yeah.
And the effect is, of course, stock market goes down. So let's put that aside and say that here we've had a bull market that has gone on for close to 13 years. Mm-hmm. And just when we thought it was going to break, here recently, those of you who've been following the market, you've seen, it's 7 days of declines, not just in the S&P, not just in NASDAQ, but Dow. I mean, all the major indices were all going in unfavorable directions for over a week. And everyone thought, okay, now it's coming. Everyone's braced for this big correction. Even we who don't live our lives thinking about financial markets, for the most part, I don't want to become an expert on how the Dow operates or experts on securities and debts. I know more than most people, but my point is I don't want to live in that world. I want to go about my business.
Right.
But yet we've all been pulled in a way, and we're leaning into this conversation because it has such huge implications for all of us. I'll bet all of you watching this know a lot more about financial terms, about markets than you did 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah, you got schooled real fast.
You did. I mean, it was a boot camp. It was a boot camp.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Definitely a boot camp.
So I can throw a few phrases around, and I can expect you guys to have some grasp of what they mean, whereas 5 years ago, maybe not. But in any case, we have to think about where we due anyway for a correction. I mean, if this has been going on for 12 years, a market that has been just steadily creeping up, it didn't go up like it were Mount Everest, but it was a steady climb. And then Mount Everest was the last year and a half. So would we have had this, would we be in for a significant pullback, a bear market? I'll use the word recession. The bear market just refers to what's happening in the stock market, whereas a recession means the economy,
right.
The GDP's gone down for 2 consecutive quarters. So you have negative growth for 2 consecutive quarters is the technical definition of a recession. Well, we've not had that.
So you're saying absent of what happened, the pandemic, we were in for this something anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only reason that we've had this unusual phenomenon, and these are my views, which are to some extent the distillation of having listened to a bunch of economists and weighing various perspectives. So you may have your own, but there's a pretty strong argument among many experts that this extraordinary, this unprecedented role that our Fed has played in our economy that was never contemplated when the Fed was created in 1913. It was not contemplated at that time that the Fed would move to front and center of determining not only how well our economy does, but where we spend money. I mean, their influence has grown, and it threatens to grow further.
It's taken on a life of its own.
It is, and it's become a little more. It is more political than it was intended to be.
Yeah.
These things were all inevitable, and yet I think there was some naivete in that Jekyll-Allen early meetings in which this vision was ironed out by capitalistic leaders in America and to some extent, I guess, the West. So people like Morgan and others who are very prominent and who, incidentally, some of you will disagree with me. I think that most of them were not doing this as a scheme to enrich themselves. Now, a number of my friends disagree with this. I think that they often, when you are wealthy, there's this, in England, you call it noblesse oblige.
I like that. What is that?
It looks like oblige noble, if you look the way it's spelled with some accent marks, but it's called a noblesse oblige.
Noblesse oblige. I like that.
And so what it means is that when you're a part of the aristocracy in Europe, and particularly the UK, this is a concept floated around UK, but also the continental countries, and you have obligations. And there was this, you often heard of these heroic endeavors on the part of members of the aristocracy, and they were the first to sign up for wars and be in the front lines. I mean, entire classes, almost the entire class of Eton and not so much Eton, which is the finishing school, but Cambridge, Oxford. I mean, their classes were decimated through World War I. And what that tells you is these children of aristocrats were not pushing off this war to someone else. Their perception was that they had an obligation,
right?
And they were raised and taught that. So they felt, look, if we go to war, we need to be in the front. They were officers often, but they died in huge numbers. So there's this concept of noblesse oblige that I think existed among a number of these industrialists who got together at the time, Jekyll-Allen. Some of you I know are shaking your head. You're very cynical. These guys were rich. They wanted to get richer. I mean, that's a theory, but in any case, I think it was naive. It's like any time you have people who become patronizing toward the common man, and their intentions may be good, like people who are socialists. I think often rich people who become socialists, their intentions, let's assume, are good, but it's just stupidity, and it accrues to harm of everybody.
Right.
Sometimes catastrophic harm. If you look at what's happened in countries around the world, thank God it's not happened to America yet. But
yeah, let's hope.
We don't know. So anyway, so that this vision of the Fed, whatever the motives of its founders, was one that the Fed was not going to be political, and it certainly was not going to subject the economy to its will. And yet that's what's happened. So its mandate originally was two things. The Fed was created to, number one, control inflation, which means economic stability, and the other was to assure full employment. Those are the two goals. And it was to be apolitical. So that's the reason the appointment process doesn't have anyone who's directly beholding or reporting to somebody who is in office, in elected office. But having said that, I think that what the Fed has done over the last 13 years is just transformative. I think it is something for which there's no precedent. So we don't know how we would have backed out of that. Let's assume Ukraine didn't happen. Let's assume there's no pandemic. How were we going to exit that after the market has become so used to interest rates that violate natural laws? There's a phrase that's used a lot is a neutral interest rate. Or sometimes you'll hear the phrase used, a natural interest rate.
Okay.
All that means is an interest rate that floats based upon supply and demand of money. And it's a wonderful mechanism. It means when there's a whole lot of demand for people wanting money to borrow a lot of money, then guess what? The rates go up, as they should. And that's a disincentive to get too crazy drunk on the punch bowl, right? Because the rates go up and you think, no, I can't afford any more debt. I better not get any more. And then they come back down, and finally, when no one's doing any investment, like investment in capital expenditures of companies where they take profits and rather than distribute them in dividends or go out and blow it, in smaller companies, go out and the families just go on vacations and whatnot. Instead, they take some of those profits and they invest them. It's called capital expenditures. So you have an incentive when interest rates drop down more and there's not been this much demand for money is to take that opportunity with low interest rates and pour it into capital investments.
Right.
So though it's a natural law, so what happens when you decide you're going to muck with that and you're going to decide to play with it artificially, which the Fed can do because it controls the money supply. So the Fed decides that they think that we were a little too depressed after and I'll start there. I won't go back, but you can actually trace the Great Recession to policies of Greenspan, and it's amazing the way in which he increased and lowered interest rates, and he lowered federal interest rates pretty dramatically over a point, even at a time when the economy wasn't really struggling. I mean, it was a year or two after the recession from 2000, the tech recession. So let's start with the Great Recession. So the Great Recession, we have this decision in the aftermath that, the economy, people aren't happy, and there may be some displeasure, there may be some discomfort.
Right.
So let's try to let people avoid that. So what they do is, and the word is used, it's like a drug, and it really is a good analogy because that's kind of what you do. If you're a doctor and you have a patient who is going to go through some discomfort, the temptation is to give them a drug.
Something to relieve the pain.
Yeah, so that they don't feel it. Right. But now more and more doctors say, no, it's part of that process, like taking away a fever is a bad thing because the fever is a clearing
mechanism.
Fever
is your friend.
Fever's your friend, and it's a clearing mechanism. For a long time, it was thought that anytime somebody has a fever, we need to give them aspirin or ibuprofen or something else.
Right.
So that's a good analogy to think about kind of the role of the Fed. So the Fed, rather than holding back and saying, look, we need to wash out, we need to have a clearing of bad decisions, bad investment, bad companies that were just kind of hanging on. So when these things happen periodically, they serve a very valuable function. Now, the Great Recession was a tough period. I'm not suggesting the government should have done nothing. I think all of us, a lot of us, would say, yeah, some of the things that were done should have been done because, it would have meant huge long-term effects for the financial markets, all these counterparties and these instruments that have been created. Anyway, so let's just focus, though, on the decision to continue with this. It's called quantitative easing, to continue providing these ultra-low interest rates to push them down, down, down until people feel better. And then once they start feeling better, we keep them there. And then if they start to not feel so good again, we lower them more. So people have gotten used to an interest rate, and markets have, and business people. Think of the thousands of decisions that have been made involving billions, trillions and trillions of dollars over the last 13 years based on free money. Think about it. What discipline is there when you give away money? What risk would you take as an investor if you knew the money was free? Now, you'd have to pay it back. I'm not saying that when you have what was close to a zero interest rate, I'm not saying that if you took $1 million, you wouldn't have to pay back $1 million. But does it make a difference whether you take $1 million and there's zero interest associated with it versus $1 million with 5% interest, which is not easy to pay. It's 5% a year. What if you get $1 million and if there's a tenth of a percent? Are you willing to pay a tenth of percent in perpetuity in order to just pocket the million? And the day that you'd have to repay it may not come. So you can see what craziness happens whenever you give away money free, and that's effectively been the case for the last 12 years. And so people take the money and they do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And often they simply buy their own shares. It's a way of increasing the return with your company. You may say, some of you are probably asking, why do people buy shares of stock? What good is that? Well, think of it this way. If you're not making much money per share, let's say you have 1 million shares outstanding, a company, and let's say you're making $1 a share. So you're not doing real well, and your shareholders are a little irritated. So you have this money that's essentially given out free.
Right.
And so you say, well, wait, if I go and I reduce the number of shares outstanding by half, then I've doubled my income per share. So you go into the market, you find the people who want to sell their shares, and of course that's what a stock exchange is, and you spend the money to buy 500,000 shares. Well, guess what you look like next year? Yeah, the income per share has doubled. So suddenly you look like a brilliant person. You're making more money. But did the company do better? Are they managing better? Do they have a better product? Did they do capital expenditures to improve the company? Was there research and development?
It's not reflective of that.
No. Yeah. Was there any new products? Any new research and development? No. But don't they look good?
They look good. Smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. And why do they do that? Well, the money was kind of free. And what they paid for it was insignificant compared to the fact that they doubled their earnings per share. So it's not the best use of money generally. There are a few cases where that makes sense, but in the vast majority of cases, it represents leadership that can't find a better solution, to put it simply. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I'm pointing to this as one of these. When you have a perfect storm, what that means is you have a number of factors that very improbably come together at the same time and produce something wildly destructive often, or something wildly unusual. And in this case, I'm afraid destructive. But not in the long run.
Apparently.
I'm an optimist, so don't misconstrue my remarks because I think that we may have a little more difficulty ahead. I'm by no means a survivalist in the sense that, I don't own something in the Montana mountains. I don't have a gallon of 5 years of food storage and whatnot. But anyway, I do believe that there are natural laws out there that require compensation when you violate them. And I think that when you look at the series of events that have come together improbably here that really are not connected. You can argue, well, the pandemic is not connected to the Ukraine except in some imaginative way. And neither is the fact that we're at the tail end of this 12-year period of easing. So we could point to a few other things incidentally. I don't intend this list to be exhaustive, but I'm just looking at these massive events that have weighed heavily on the world economy and particularly the United States economy. And when you put these three factors I just mentioned, where we have a war, we have lots of expenditures now we didn't anticipate. And when I talk about when I talk about Ukraine, I'm really talking, I should talk more generally about economic sanctions because maybe there's a better way or a different point to make. I'll say that. And that's deglobalization. So if we were adding a factor to this, I would add deglobalization. And that picks up, the trade wars that are going on.
Right.
And they were going on in advance of this. So these are not really related.
Yeah, that's not new, really.
Right. So but we have to talk about Ukraine separately, but still, deglobalization is a phenomenon that's developed just in the past 2 or 3 years. Trump accelerated it, granted, over his dispute with China, which I applaud. But still, deglobalization was going on. So we thought, beginning with the turn into this century, that the world barriers were going to crumble and that the world would become this friendly, competitive place and that you would have comparative value, which means that you have countries that are strong in one area, produce that, and they use this thing to buy things from countries that are strong in another area. So they kind of trade products, but they do that using money. Things like that make free trade a wonderful thing for the world at large. So if you can have free trade, true free trade, naturally everybody wants it. It's the natural, healthy condition for the world economy. But realistically, I think we deceived ourselves because we went through a period where China was growing rapidly. They were more friendly at that time, and we were willing to overlook their misbehavior, their stealing of trade secrets, intellectual property, et cetera. I mean, all that stuff we were willing to kind of overlook because we thought, we want to bring them into the world and then we'll civilize them.
Yeah.
But it never really happened.
No, it didn't.
And they became increasingly militaristic. They have become more militaristic in the last 5 to 6 years, but they were increasingly confrontational on an economic scale and really exploitive of our kindness. They took advantage of us, and we were naive and generous. The West was, and they invited our companies to come in, and they just blatantly stole their technology and then kicked them out when they complained, or even if they didn't complain. In some cases, they were kicked out. So
wasn't fair play.
The globalization thing, it was a wonderful era in many ways. It couldn't continue. We couldn't let it continue under China's terms. So now walls are going up with various countries around the world, and with these walls coming up, deglobalization is going to have a huge impact. It's going to have an impact that's going to increase costs. There will be supply chain issues. Maybe not the way they are now. I think it'll settle down from this craziness that we have right now.
So you believe it'll get better within the next, say, couple of years?
I think most experts believe that. Yeah. I think the vast majority of experts believe it'll get better. Much of this is related. That's related to the pandemic. Those supply chain issues.
At least we still have toilet paper.
Yeah,
we're not facing that problem anymore.
Depending on what Putin does in the next 10 days.
Oh boy.
Well, anyway, though, I do think, we'll have supply chain issues long term on a lower scale. Just because when you have deglobalization, it means there's more obstacles to importation and exportation of goods. There are just more obstacles. So there's lots of bilateral trade agreements. So rather than assuming that you can have international free trade, instead you have to find your allies. You have to do individual bilateral deals. So it becomes very quirky, clunky, inefficient, and unpredictable because things change.
I would think so.
And I'm afraid that we'll have on a more general scale, we'll have an Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc. Now, some of the Eastern Bloc, like Japan, will, of course, and South Korea and Taiwan will participate with any trade agreements that exist in the West. But I do think there will be several countries that will unite in the aftermath of this, and they may engage in some trade with us, of course. I don't think this will be.
But you think there's going to be like separate camps?
Yeah,
almost?
there'll be camps. I think for sure. I'd love to think I'm wrong, but anyway, so that inefficiency. So what are the implications of all these forces that I've mentioned? And one of the implications of all these forces I've mentioned is inflation. I mean, inflation's coming, and it's here.
It's here.
We're at 7.9%. As of this show, the last report I saw, and this is the official, this is the headline inflation number, was 7.6, then to 7.9, and some are predicting that it's going to go higher. I think it'll go higher, but
yeah, unfortunately.
I mean, do I think it's going to come down in the next less than 2 years? Yes. The thing about doing shows like this is it really puts you on the line. All those conversations that we all have with our friends and family and whatnot, rarely are they recorded to where somebody can say to you, you're predicted such and such. So
there's a record of this.
Yeah. So what I'm talking about here are just my opinions, and historically, I guess I can say from an investment standpoint that I've been right more than wrong, but that leaves a lot of opportunity to be wrong. So in this case, I'd like to think that, for example, the inflation will not go to double digits. I tend to think it will. Now, not high double digits, not crazy double digits, but do I think we can suppress it before it goes up another couple of points? I don't think so. And then, of course, there are those.
What's going to happen is going to happen.
Yeah. And many people would argue that these rates are not accurate anyway, that they're artificially low. And I know that they are, because many of you are thinking, well, wait, I can tell you that the things that I buy are up more than 7.5%
Oh, my
to
goodness.
8%.
A couple of weeks ago, I filled up my Santa Fe, and normally it took, $35. $57. And I looked and I thought, no, there's got to be a mistake. And I'm like, no, guess it's gone way up.
Yeah.
But it was shocking. I mean, I had sticker shock.
And I think that many people will price that expectation in. And that's the thing about inflation. Inflation, believe it or not, is largely a psychological phenomenon. Now, if you ask what's called a monetarist, I hate to use these phrases because the purpose of this show is to really be helpful and to not to use a bunch of technical terms to where you walk away understanding maybe half of what was said. How many times do you have that experience watching financial shows? I sometimes have that experience following financial shows, and I know a lot more than most.
Right.
So I really don't want this show to be something where we use technical terms to show how smart we are. I want us instead to aspire above all to be understood. So with that in mind, though, I do want to mention that monetarists are people who believe that, as Milton Friedman famously said, anywhere and everywhere, inflation is a product of the inflation of the increase of the money supply. So I guess when I think of probably the most prominent advocate of the monetarist school, it has to be Friedman. Friedman is far and away clearly the person who is the champion of this school, a Nobel Prize winner, incidentally. And he was at University of Chicago. I'm a big fan of University of Chicago.
I did know that.
2 daughters went to University of Chicago. Mm-hmm. I really think it's the best university in the world. And I believe that before they went there. It may have influenced their going there. I don't know. But anyway, so Friedman was famously it's a school of thought, actually a philosophy. It's called the Chicago School. But when they say that in economics, they're talking about a philosophy of economics, and they call it the Chicago School. But it's just it's a philosophy that, quite frankly, I'm not sure the majority of the faculty, I am sure, in fact, the majority of the faculty today probably does not hold. But it's still called that because at the time it was, I guess, the point of origin of this theory was at University of Chicago. There are several very prominent economists who advocated this view. And some regard it as the antithesis of what Keynes would say. And really, it's not the antithesis, actually. I've heard Milton Friedman, who has been interviewed on this topic, and he had some good things to say, believe it or not. He was not Keynesian, but still he had some good things, and he felt that Keynes was misunderstood. Those of you who are interested in that topic. But anyway, so a monetarist would say, look, in all cases, it relates to an increase in money supply. Well, the pandemic, we know, caused a policy that was already firmly entrenched, which was that of accommodation, of quantitative easing, to be put on steroids. So we saw that magnified 2-3-fold during the 18 or so months of the depths.
Stimulus
and
checks.
So we saw that the balance sheet of the Fed, which you might think the balance sheet of the Fed, if you had asked them in 1913 I guess it was officially, I think it was officially passed by law in 13. It may have been 14. Anyway, if you had asked Congress at the time, or you had asked these people at TuckerAllen who kind of conceived this notion, if you had asked them, so what would you predict would be on the balance sheet of the Fed? I think they would predict a balance sheet that it might temporarily go up, when the Fed would rush in to deal with an emergency. Pandemic's an emergency. So they would say, well, it would occasionally go up, but then it would quickly shrink back down, kind of like a wave coming up on the beach. And if you have a high wave, then storms, then you're going to see that more quantitative easing, which means that when the way that they increase their balance sheet is that they take money, which they invent, create, whatever, and they go out and buy stuff. They buy debt. They buy Fed securities. They buy AAA corporate securities, maybe AA corporate, like bonds. They go out and buy these. It's debt, incidentally. They're not buying equities here in the United States, unlike the Fed at the Bank of England. But anyway,
right.
So not Bank of England, Bank of Japan.
Japan.
Anyway, so if you had asked them, what do you think, though, that for any period of time would be the balance on the Fed's balance sheet? And I think they'd say close to zero, because they'd expect that over time they would dump whatever they had to run out and buy to push money into the economy. Well, I can tell you right now, we're at close to 10 trillion, 9.5 or something, trillion on the balance sheet of the Fed. And they've not started, they're a long way from reducing it. They're fearful of reducing it. They're increasing rates now because they do intend we're going to get serious about inflation. So now, serious, it turns out, is a 1/4 point increase from virtually zero. So they're still under 1 point. So, and that's a federal funds rate. So what they have accumulated over time has worked its way up to over $9 trillion. Even before the pandemic, we were above $5 trillion. We may have dropped below 5 to 4 point something trillion. But then it quickly went up. And I think we can all agree it went up far more than it should have. Far more than it should have. So how's the Fed going to get rid of this? And the way that one way to get rid of it is to go ahead and sell these securities back. And what happens when you sell securities back? People in the economy give money to the Fed. So you may say, well, how do they pull back money supply? Two mechanisms primarily. Okay. One is through the federal funds rate. If they increase the rate of money, then that means they reduce the amount of money circulating because the cost is higher. But another mechanism that they don't talk a lot about, the way to decrease this money supply that we're all aware of, that has gone up, the money supply has increased at a rate faster than any time in America's history. Not quite to the extent of the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I. But I mean, we can see what happens when you decide to dump a lot of money onto the market. Right. Anyway, so another way, though, to reduce inflation, to take money out, because remember, that's what the monetarists believe inflation at root always is too much money, is you buy back. So, you sell the securities that you've already bought. So if they have U.S. Treasury bonds, if they have corporate bonds, and they total up to, let's say, $10 trillion, they could take $10 trillion out of the economy in days. Now, this is not something we'd want them to do because it would be scary, the impact it would have.
Yeah, I'm wondering how that would work.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess the dollar would go up in value. Inflation would definitely disappear. But we could go into a recession. Because a recession, remember, is where a dollar has more value. So, deflation is a scary thing because that's what we saw in the Great Depression where the problem wasn't there was too much money and you had inflation and things were very expensive or they were nominally expensive. No, in the Great Depression, prices went down because money was so scarce that people couldn't come up with enough money to pay for things. So if bread was 50 cents a loaf, they had to lower the price to 30 cents a loaf. And even then, people didn't have 30 cents. So that's what happens when you have a circumstance in which you have money that increases in value. The opposite of inflation is deflation. So deflation can be a very scary thing. But would it cause deflation if the Fed turned around and did this? I think it would. But just to illustrate a point to you, if the Fed decides that they want to stop inflation and they want to stop it now, they could turn around and dump all of these securities, $10 trillion. So that means that $10 trillion will come out of the circulation in some form, and it'll be dumped into the Fed. The Fed will essentially lock it up. So it's gone, effectively. Might as well have been destroyed. So now the money supply has gone down $10 trillion. That's an example of one of the tools the Fed has to where they can reverse what they've done. Remember, the way they put it in was they decided we're going to buy these securities. So they buy it with new money. So when they acquired that $10 trillion, that meant they dumped $10 trillion into the economy, money that wasn't there. They printed it, and they distributed it. Sometimes they don't have to print it. Sometimes it's digital. But the point's the same. It increases the money supply.
It's pretty impressive, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful tool. So when you think about inflation, you think about all these forces are all working toward inflation. They all are inflationary forces. And the one force that I'll mention quickly, and then we'll move on because I want to wrap this up here. One force that doesn't get a lot of conversation now, but I think will in the next few years, is the demographic changes that are happening. I mean, the low birth rate. It's been going on for a long time, and China right now is already within 4 or 5 years of feeling it in terms of the ability of those who are retiring versus those who are in the workforce. That ratio. You has to maintain a certain balance, and when it doesn't, then you become a poorer nation because you don't have the ability to be productive. Your productivity for any level of technology, if you were to freeze technology, any level of productivity is going to be governed by the number of individuals you have to work in. If you freeze technology, so by definition, if you have fewer people that are in the workforce, and that's where China is. Japan, of course, is the role model for this sort of difficulty, but China is probably the biggest problem because they have such a huge economy and so many people that when a substantial part pulls out, it's a crisis for a whole lot of older people. So I think that when we think about these inflationary forces, which I've talked about today, I just want to throw out one that I think will be a powerful factor going forward that we need to consider, and that's this fact of demographics. And it is inflationary. If I characterized it as deflationary, then I misspoke, because I think that this will force up prices unless there's a technological solution. The deflationary force would be the technological solutions. And some say that those are going to come fast enough to compensate for this reduction in people in the U.S. Right. You can see we have these trends. Everywhere in the West, we're not producing at a rate to replace ourselves. This is true in the West and it's true in the East. Only in the Southern Hemisphere, are you seeing this going on? But where I think it counts for the world right now is what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's just for various reasons. You can supply your own. We've been seeing this rate fall in China. We know it was legislated, but China is facing a problem that I don't think technology can rescue it in time. In the long term, technology will allow us to get a lot more done with fewer people.
Right.
But is it going to come in less than 10 years? Because their problem will be felt in a big way in 10 years. So Kathy Wood of ARK Investing, she's real famous for being an advocate of the idea that no, technology's coming so fast and so powerfully that it's going to solve all these problems, and productivity is going to go way up in the West and in the industrialized world especially, that we should all be buying these growth stocks. But I won't get off on that idea. I'm not a fan of that view. But I wanted to acquaint you, though, with these economic forces and to make some comments about them. So my prediction would be that I think we're going to have inflation for the balance of this year. I think the Fed's probably going to get serious in the not too distant future. They're not now. They increased a point last week. A quarter of a point last week. I think they'll get serious by the end of the year. So I do see inflation coming down. I just don't think it'll come down this year. So what do you do with this with the things we've talked about? I kind of wanted to quickly make a few comments. And I know some of y'all, this is a longer video than we normally do, I guess. And so I know some of y'all will tune out. I get that. Some of you, I think, might be interested. So, what do you do with your money? Three big options that loom out there and kind of dominate the range of movement. One is bonds, the other is stocks, the other is real estate. Bonds, of course, we're scared of because, if rates do in fact go, if the Fed increases rates as they are, then it means that the face value of bonds will come down. It means interest rates will go up. So you have to keep in mind this inverse relationship between interest rates and the price of bond. So that means if you buy a bond and the market rate of interest is, say, 5% now, doesn't matter what the bond is. If the market rate of interest is 5% and you buy a bond for $1,000, if the market rate of interest goes up to 6%, then that bond will the value of it will be reduced so that it's in effect yielding 6%. So it means, I don't know what the math is on that, but so if you bought a $1,000 bond, it'd probably go down to something like $800. Don't hold me to that math. So the whole idea, though, is I want you to get that why it happens, that if you have a market rate of interest that goes up, then people are going to say, well, I want the 6%. I don't want the 5%. And the only way they can get the 6% with your bond is for them to pay $800 for it, not $1,000. So when they pay $800, guess what? They're getting the market rate. Now, it's true in the opposite direction, too, is the good news. So if rates go down and you have a bond that's worth $1,000 at the time you buy it and it's paying 5% interest and rates go down and 5% turns out to be a great number, let's say the market rate's 4%. Guess what? Your bond's going to sell for like $1,200, whatever the math is. But I want you to understand this inverse relationship. So now we're in an environment where it looks like rates are going up. And so as long as rates are going up, I don't want to buy a bond that the face value is going to go down.
Right.
Now, it's true you can hold a bond until it matures and it'll pay face value. But you're going to be going through a lot of economic change during that period of time, and you're stuck. You can't move out of the bond. Stocks, I've said this before. I think if you're determined to buy stocks now, I would focus on stocks that are called value stocks, meaning stocks that have low PE ratios. That means that they're bargains. That means that, for example, the stock price might be the PE ratio, the ratio between the earnings per share and the price per share.
Okay.
That's a PE ratio. It kind of makes sense. How much did it earn? If you take the earnings and divide it by the total number of shares, how much did each share earn? And then when you look at the ratio of that, then it tells you what's called the PE ratio, the price to earnings ratio. And it's based on per share. So you'll notice that all the high-flying tech companies, many of them, they're notorious for having PE ratios very high, meaning they don't earn much, but people pay a whole lot of money for them because they see this pie in the sky, or they see profits down the road. So those are called growth stocks. In other words, you're not buying earnings, you're buying the potential growth sometime down the road. But the alternative is another kind of the opposite approach, is to buy value stocks. And value stocks are the reverse. It's where you're saying, wow, this is a PE ratio of 5-to-1 or 10-to-1 or 12-to-1. I mean, that means that they're earning a lot of money for the price. So that you can see it kind of makes it a bargain. It kind of makes it a good value. And often those stocks
get more bang for your buck.
You do. And often they pay dividends. They almost assuredly have good earnings if they have that PE ratio. so at a time when there's lots of uncertainty and we don't know where interest rates are going and we don't know where new technologies will end up because so much of it is futuristic, there's a temptation to follow the strategy that Warren Buffett famously has, and that's where he tends to focus on buying bargain stocks, and he sticks with things that he knows, industries that he understands, products and services that he understands, things that he knows that come heck or high water, they're not going away. Mars candy bars, Coca-Cola. He sticks with things that are fundamental, even like railroad stocks. Now, and you may say, well, railroads seem to have declined in the last 100 years, but not in a fundamental way. Meaning, passenger trains went away, but what he knows is that to transport goods in America, it's pretty reliable that we'll continue to use those because it's so efficient and so cheap compared to trucks.
It's not going away.
So he sticks with things like that, and that gives him the confidence that when we have a downturn in the economy, that, these will be affected some, but are people still going to buy food? Are they still going to buy, you mentioned toilet paper, are they still going to buy things like that?
Of course.
Staples? So there are lots of things that we can be pretty confident that they're not going to go away. And further, the PE ratio, the amount that you're paying per share for the amount of money you're getting per share. I mean, that is a very good, it's a bargain number compared to growth stocks, for example. So if you're going to look at stocks, I think that that's the safest way to proceed. You're not going to lose your shirt that way. And there's a lot of funds that are value funds. We ought to post on the website the fact that Morningstar is a great place to list a lot of funds. And these, incidentally, can be mutual funds. They can be ETFs. And I won't get into the difference of those two, but both have their merits. But the point is they're a collection of a bunch of them, so you don't have to choose one stock or one particular industry because, you don't want all your eggs in one basket in this scenario we're describing. So I would suggest that you do consider looking at growth stocks if you're going to be in stocks. Let me mention here, another approach is to be in cash. You may say, well, wait, why would I have cash in an inflationary time? Look, there's going to be some devastation, and those have the ability to pick things up, to pick up bargains later, I think will be in a much better shape. So do you lose 5% of your purchasing power, maybe a little more, over the course of a year? Yeah, but is that going to be offset by the decline in prices, by the depreciation that's going to occur in real estate and stocks and everything else to where you will make more than you will lose by holding your money in purchasing power? I tend to think so. So some of the best analysts say cash is the lesser evil despite the inflation. Real estate, I wouldn't buy real estate now, at least residential, and I don't know enough about.
Yeah, it's still a seller's market, big time.
I've bought some commercial buildings, office space, but I'm not by no means an expert on it, and it's a real tumultuous market now. I mean, there's a lot of change going on. We don't know what percent of the workforce is going to end up returning to these buildings. Yeah,
the brick and mortar, right?
I was reading in Manhattan, the 30% of the workforce has returned to those office buildings in Manhattan.
In Manhattan?
It's shocking.
Yeah.
Just shocking. And even though the real estate market's doing well, I mean, when I say real estate, I meant residential real estate. The residential real estate market's on fire. I mean, it's just an odd thing. And so I don't know what they're going to do with this additional space, but there's an article on this topic in the Wall Street Journal. Anyway, so real estate you have to do very carefully. So I'll talk more about residential because I know more about it. I would stay out of it in terms of buying right now. I would wait. I think, it may go up a little more this year, but it's going to settle, and I think it's going to give up a little bit. I think there will be a retreat probably next year. I don't see a massive retreat.
At some point it does.
Yeah, I don't see a bubble, but I could be wrong. But even if I'm wrong, then so much the better, because if you hold back thinking there's just going to be a retreat and it ends up being a rout, so much the better for you. But either way, I wouldn't be buying in right now. It's
not a good time.
That's what I personally am doing. So if it's bad advice, I can tell you I believe in it enough to where that's what I'm doing, and I think it's good advice. So I'm going to hold back on buying more residential now. Now, I will say this. If you own residential, probably is a good time to sell it. If you're thinking about selling it, not if you're in a house that you want to
Right.
you want to be carried out, to the funeral home out of that house, then yeah, obviously you don't sell it. But for those of you who are thinking, I think I want to sell this house, I'm waiting for the right time, now's the right time.
Yeah, you're going to get the most bang for your buck right now.
This is it. I can't imagine it getting any better. It might get a little bit better. Who knows? I would have told you I couldn't imagine it getting any better 6 months ago. But it won't keep getting better. Meaning when you have a supply down at these shockingly low levels, it won't stay this way. I'm telling you. Plus, we have a lot of construction going on. This construction is going to come online in the next 6 months. I mean, it's not the same amount of construction everywhere, and I don't know about St. Louis specifically. But I look at a number of markets. It's funny. I look the least at St. Louis market because I have investments in other places. But the point is, I can tell you that shockingly low supplies almost everywhere. And this cannot go on.
I was reading an article about Dallas last week, and they had a huge drop in residential inventory just in the past 7 months or so.
Yeah, Dallas.
And I can't remember the numbers, but it was really, really.
They're one of those on fire. Dallas, of course, Austin.
Yeah.
But some people think, it's just Austin in Texas. No, Dallas has been on fire too.
Wow.
And Raleigh is oddly enough, has had one of the biggest drops in inventory. I mean, it's just, we know that what happens throughout human history when you have this much demand for housing. You have builders come in and fill it. Mm-hmm. So don't doubt that despite the hardships with supply chains and whatnot, I can tell you builders are out there through crook and hook to build houses, and they're determined to do it. And I think that we're going to have some relief in terms of supply.
An opportunity for them
later in the year, which means that would have a easing effect on prices. So I'm suggesting if you do own a house and you do plan to sell it anytime soon, I'm just telling you, if it were my house, I'd sell it now. I'd sell it yesterday. Two other points I didn't make is, this is a recommendation that I really think might be worth considering for those of us who are over 60. Now is really a good time to enter the labor market on your own terms. There's gig economy, which means you just kind of make yourself out there to do particular jobs. So you're like an independent contractor and you might...
Freelancer. Yeah,
freelancer. You're out there to take jobs as they come. You take some, you turn back others. There's that. But there's also such a vast range of options that's available to you now that wouldn't have been available to you 2 years ago. It may not be available to you 2 years from now.
But it is right now. It's pretty hot.
Yeah, I mean, anything you wanted to do, anything that you thought, well, I'm not really qualified to do that. Now, let's put aside things like brain surgery, but things that you thought, well, working in Lowe's, for example, you may think, that'd be kind of a cool job to have, but I don't know much about tools and construction. There are lots of examples like that. I'm telling you, well, now, let me tell you, they'll hire you, number one. And number two, you'll learn it. And we're talking about only things you like. So naturally don't consider something you don't want to do. But people who are over 60 now, this is a great opportunity for you to cherry pick some income. You choose something to do that you like, that's not miserable.
The wages are so much higher.
Oh, and going higher. Yeah. I mean, Amazon's hiring left and right. And Amazon is a serious job.
Right.
Meaning it might be more work than any of us would want, actually. But I have a friend who had no background in that field at all and wandered in, and they hired him, and now he has all these stock options, and he keeps getting pay raises, substantial pay raises. So I'm just telling you that in this economy, if you're somebody who's willing to show up, you're suddenly a prize employee.
Yeah.
You get all these pay raises because
they're going to do anything to keep you.
Yeah, and the people you're competing against, where there's just America, unfortunately, there's not the level of initiative, I'm afraid, that we saw with the boomer generation. But whether or not that's true, I can tell you this is true. Right now is about as good a time as you will have ever had, and I suspect will ever have, to go out and cherry pick a job that you want to do part-time or full-time. It's a good way for you to cushion your retirement fund, to add some extra money for whatever purposes you might have, this is a good time to think about that. And all too often people, once they retire and they spend a year or two pursuing their hobbies, then suddenly they rule out the possibility of returning to work and doing something. Maybe this is a good time to do that. And one final point, seems like off the point, but I'm going to make it as we wrap up. One of the best things you can do for your financial well-being is to maintain your health. And I'm mentioning this because I have in mind a friend who I visited recently. I want to be very vague about these comments. Who I visited recently.
Yeah, don't want to give them away.
And he has retired. Has been retired for a little while. Has gained weight, and we talk about his plans. And he has plans just like all of us do. You do, I do, and I'm looking at him and looking at some of the issues that he's had. Again, I don't want to name that, but he's had a few issues with his health. Much of it related to inactivity and the weight issue.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, how do you simultaneously make these financial arrangements, which he does very well. He plans financially in a very methodical way, and yet neglect the vehicle that
your retirement
that you require to take you there. So there's something absurdly perverse about people who develop future plans with such glee and such particularity and such care, and all the while being completely inattentive to the body, the vehicle that has to be in good shape to deliver them there. It's like the vehicle doesn't matter. It's like, I just need to work on these things out there. And it's like as if it's possible to forget that this thing has to be in good shape to get you there,
right,
and to experience.
For you to enjoy it there.
Yeah, and to me that is so obvious, but I look around me and I see people who it appears that thought has never occurred to.
And I don't think it's intentional. No. I don't.
I mean, no, not intentional, meaning they want to do that, but do they do it knowingly? That's different from intentionally.
Why do they neglect? I mean, there's 100 different reasons.
There are, and I don't want to be judgmental. So, I mean, I know it's hard. I mean, and it's not, it's harder for some than others. It's easy for some people to say, why can't you do this? Because I can do this. Well, there are other things that other person can do that I can't do, for example. So, we all have to be careful about being judgmental. So I'm making this point to you as somebody who wants to say something useful to you that goes well, believe it or not, with everything else we've talked about. This is just as relevant to everything we've talked about. And my bigger point to you is it's relevant to everything in your life in which you're planning for a wonderful future, and yet you might fail to consider the importance of maintaining the machine, the vehicle, the body that you are utterly dependent on to deliver you to that goal. So that's probably a good point to wrap up on.
Covered a lot of good points.
We did. Some of you I bored stiff. I know that. I'm hoping there are a few of you that hung out for this whole, I don't want to say diatribe, lecture, whatever, discussion.
Learning session.
Speculation, maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway, we do this show with the intention of being useful, and I hope this is useful to you. Remember, I'm not an expert. I'm not a financial analyst. Anything I say to you, I'm just telling you kind of.
But you can play one on a podcast.
Yeah, right, on a podcast, not television. And I'm telling you, my thinking out loud. So I kind of shared with you what I think about out loud and what I do with my life. Maybe that's a better way to think about it than to think that I'm saying, you need to do these things. A few of them I might say that of, for example, the last point. But anyway, I hope this was helpful. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.